Right. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to take part today. I've really enjoyed the session so far this morning, even with a bit of nerves, kind of eating away at the same time, which I'm sure a few of us might be able to relate to. Just a couple of housekeeping things to start off with. I've shared the slides, so if anyone would like to go through at their own pace, then hopefully they'll find that useful. They're quite visual slides, so I've put kind of like a transcript of when I did a practice in the notes, and hopefully it'll be similar to how I go through today. And there are the references and some resources in there as well. So if you'd find that useful, that's there in the chat. Let me know if there's any issues with that link working. Okay, so I'm Julia Sarju, and I'm from the University of York, and I'm going to be talking about diversity in STEM education. Briefly, I'm going to talk about the role of graduate teaching assistants, GTAs in practical teaching, the training of GTAs, and lessons learned so far. In terms of a good starting point, let's start off by defining inclusive teaching. So Dewsbury says that this is a philosophy of learning that provides equal opportunities for all students to have a successful learning experience. And one of the GTAs on our training course described this, really similarly and simply by you want to provide equal opportunities and access to everyone. Okay, so starting with, why is it important to talk about inclusivity? Well, currently and for a very long time, there's been unequal access, unequal experience, unequal attainment in STEM education and employment. And this means that many students are not having a fair experience. And this is especially true for students with minoritized or marginalized identities. And for students who have multiple minoritized identities, they experience unique and compounded challenges. So, for example, sexualized racism, racialized sexism. And really importantly, in addition to moral and legal obligations, we're missing out, our fields are missing out on this huge wealth of diverse talent. So we want to make sure that we improve our teaching, our learning environments, our behaviors and society to make sure that we stop doing this. Okay, so just to take a couple of examples, this one first from the UK, looking at participation, you can see at the people who are declaring disabilities, in STEM, the students are lower than those declaring in the population. If you move on to academia, faculty roles, it's much lower. And then if you look at a major funder, UKRI, who've published really openly their diversity data recently, you can see that just looking at applications, it's really low again. And they were very honest that they weren't able to share the information for successful grants because of the numbers being so low. Okay. Looking at another identity characteristic, this time race, looking at minority ethnic groups in the US, you can see that just moving from undergraduate students to postgraduate students, there's a significant drop in participation, and this is continued then as well in faculty positions. Today we're focusing on practical teaching, and we know that this makes up a really large amount of the time that the students and us spend. It's a significant cost, and in general, practical teaching is really highly valued by students and faculty. And this is a place where making sure the environment, the learning resources, the instructions are equitable will have a huge impact on our undergraduate students, their learning and their overall experience. So having a quick look at some of the research that's that's looked into experiences in STEM teaching labs, there's a lot more work that needs to be done to understand the experiences of students in our labs, but there's already been quite a lot of really important and sometimes quite distressing work. So for example, there are reports looking at the inaccessibility of practical labs, reports citing chilly environments for students with minoritized identities, students experiencing direct discrimination, perhaps on the basis of gender or race or class. There's also evidence of gendered task distribution in physics laboratories, leading to inequitable educational outcomes and skills development amongst students there. And there are reports generally suggesting lower senses of belonging of students with minoritized identities to their department and their subject. And we've also seen a lot of studies linking belonging to attainment and retention. So a bit of a worrying picture there, to say the least. Now, graduate teaching assistants, GTAs, have a really key role in labs. They'll spend a lot of time in there, a lot of direct contact between undergraduate students and graduate teaching assistants. And I suppose the diversity of their lived experience is more likely to be similar to the undergraduate students as we look at the difficulties in access in academic roles. Now, there is a lot of research highlighting, and we can make strong arguments that graduate teaching assistants are likely to have much less direct pedagogical content knowledge, training, perhaps even subject knowledge, and teaching experience than faculty members. But it's really important that we value their diverse lived experiences as well, and also their recent experiences as learners in undergraduate teaching for many graduate students. Okay, so looking at GTA training, here in the Department of York, this is coordinated by Glenn Hurst, and he's written about this training split into 5 main sections, including lab shadowing, mentoring, and self-reflection. And Glenn kindly invited me to take part and talk about accessibility and diversity in my role as disability rep in the department, and joining the communication workshop. He's very kind to give me quite a bit of free rein, and in very helpful discussions with Leonie Jones, our Diversity and Employment Officer, came up with the key session aims, which were to share resources, signpost GTAs to key people for support and key information, and really to encourage participants to reflect on accessibility and inclusivity in practical chemistry teaching, encouraging the adoption of inclusive teaching practices rather than having specific scenario-based training. If you have a student declaring X, this is what you should do, which could lead to stereotyping, and also within the time it would be very difficult to have a lot of impact with that. Later on, students do receive kind of specific advice, for example, how to support students who can't wear a face mask in teaching labs during COVID, specific adaptations for individual students, and that's done in an appropriate way, whether it's direct communication with a particular GTA who will be working with that student, or a lab briefing if more people need to be aware. Okay, so how was this training delivered? Due to COVID, that's probably the only time I'm going to mention COVID, it was online using Zoom and making use of the workshops. The trainees were provided with the slides and resources in advance. I covered some core concepts of inclusivity, protected characteristics and legal obligations, accessibility of digital resources, and shared some of the experiences that students had shared of their experience in teaching labs. The students then broke into small groups and discussed good and bad behaviours and factors that can affect building inclusive cultures or exclusive cultures. And then again, the second discussion on sharing good and bad practice. And the students were encouraged to share their own experience if they wanted to, but they certainly weren't under any expectation to. And it was clear that everyone needed to respect each other's experiences and what they needed to share. Okay, they fed back through Google Forms and also an open discussion. And after the workshop, I shared targeted resources based on the topics that had come up, summaries of the discussion so they could use that afterwards with the permission of the people who submitted it, and answers to anonymous questions that the students could pose, and also non-anonymous questions. Okay, so what came up in the discussion? So the discussion was really broad, and the students and the GTAs discussed how the students might have different experiences based on gender, ethnicity, disability status, class. They also commented on that the GTAs themselves might have different experiences or be treated differently. They discuss the importance of being aware of implicit biases, the importance of inclusive practice, and that they won't always be aware what's going on in someone's life, whether they have a disability, if they've suffered a relationship breakdown, bereavement, or having a bad day. And so it's really important as part of being a good teacher to be inclusive. In terms of the discussion of good practice or bad practice, it tends to split down to three key themes. So behavior and traits, communication and practical advice. And some of the examples were making sure that you use an individual's pronouns correctly and that you don't make any assumptions. And also practical things in terms of making sure you're not covering your mouth when you're speaking so that people can hear you, and lip read. Okay. The GTA feedback was very positive, and some of the participants would say they felt very positive about adopting inclusive practice. Others that they felt that this is something they were going to, really need to work on and wanted to learn more about. The breakout rooms were really valued. And some commented that usually that they would feel really daunted by going into a breakout room for discussion, but they felt that was a key part of the sessions. And there was requests for more pre-materials to help them prepare for those discussions, and that's something I will be looking at in the future. So the key takeaways from this whistle-stop tour that the graduate teaching assistants are really important partners in practical teaching, and that they engage in really rich discussions of inclusive teaching, drawing on their own lived experience, which I learned a lot from, and I think we all can. And that the GTA so far, there's been 2 workshops this year. They really valued the incorporation of equality, diversity and inclusion topics as part of this GTA training. So that just leaves me to say a huge thank you to all of the people who've helped, to Leonie Jones and Glenn Hurst, to Disability Services and the University of York, for the CLEAR Fund and Learning Science for funding, and for Dino for all of his encouragement. So thank you very much, and thank you to everyone for listening.
Thank you so much. I must apologize. I did actually read out the wrong introduction for you. So I introduced Stephen for a second time. I do apologize, but that was on my screen as I read it out. Okay. Has there any questions from the crowd? So this is actually the first talk we've had, I think, in CLEAR about our demonstrators and our training for our demonstrators. I think it's really, really important. Are you getting student input into the design of the activities?
That's a really good question. So in terms of the 2 workshops that have just run, they were part of kind of the first stage of a larger project. And they were informed by undergraduate student feedback through the disability student forums. But they weren't developed in partnership with graduate teaching assistants. And so in the next phase, I want to survey graduate teaching assistants and undergraduate students on their priorities for this training. So I suppose taking a consultative approach. And I would really like to be able to work directly with graduate teaching assistants to deliver, but also design and kind of expand on the training. And to do, the department have agreed for us to have more time, and next step is to get some funding for somebody to work with.
Great. And did you experience any pushback from any demonstrators, GTAs, who disagree?
That's a really good question. So in the 2 workshops I've been talking about today that were online, that didn't come up at all. However, when I did the initial trial, which was pre-COVID, starting to work on kind of having more discussion. I did observe a student who was, I'm trying to think of the right way to say it, quite reluctant to talk about diversity, and not just uncomfortable, but they kind of they took a quite disruptive role in the discussion. What was interesting when we were facilitating that, though, was that the other graduate students very much kept the focus on inclusivity and diversity, and they valued it very highly. And so although that student was able to speak and express their opinions, they were challenged by the rest of the students in the group.
Okay. Great. Thank you so much for that. That was wonderful.
Thank you.